Professor Wiesel said in 2003 that we're living in times of great urgency. And he went on to correct himself and he said, no, we're not living in times of great urgency, we're living in a time of a great emergency. And this was in 2003 when he spoke about the rise of anti-Semitism and the fear he had with the reemergence of anti-Semitism and the most fear and concern he had had since the end of the Second World War, the end of the Holocaust. And for us to see, while survivors are still alive, the reemergence of anti-Semitism in various forms, I call it anti-Semitisms, and I'll get into it in a moment. There's different types of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms. But for survivors to witness the reemergence of anti-Semitism, for us in our community, for our grandchildren and our children to go to the finest institutions in the Western world, and yes, in the United States of America, where they are being taught, and I'm choosing my words deliberately and carefully, they're being taught to hate themselves as who they are as a people, to hate themselves of who they are as a people. And our community, in my view, and in the view of many scholars who are on the front line, our community has remained silent. Our community has remained silent for all sorts of reasons, and I assure you that all of these reasons that we have been silent for are short-term considerations. But if we take a long-term view and put anti-Semitism into historical context, and to put the reemergence of this oldest hatred, the reemergence of this hatred which is on the front line in our university system, that our silence is problematic. Our silence is our mistake. And I think that I'm glad that many people have come here under the leadership of Rabbi Gershon on a Sunday, on a beautiful sunny Sunday, to come and hear a lecture on anti-Semitism. And I think it points to the fact that finally, in 2017, our community is beginning to wake up. Our community is now, today, in the last few months, for sure, in the last few years, around Shabbat tables and around discussions, people have been discussing the reemergence of anti-Semitism. But if there was any doubt, and I think when Rabbi Gershon and I spoke in November, one of our concerns was, how do we convey to this community, to the Jewish community in the United States of America, that anti-Semitism is a serious issue that our community needs to engage? And we were still concerned several months ago that the community was sort of sleeping through a revolution. But today, perhaps unfortunately, in difficult situations, you make lemonade from lemons. And this is a difficult time, but today, finally, I think in March 2017, our community is realizing that there are problems, that anti-Semitism is here. And I'll explain in a moment why anti-Semitism has arrived on the shores of the United States, but I want to drive home one point. The front line of anti-Semitism in the United States of America is on college campuses, where young people are being trained, where the future leaders of industry, of society, of politics, our journalists, our media of record are being trained at the finest institutions in this country, that the front line, the battle of anti-Semitism is on the battlefield of ideas, and it's at university campuses. Professor Barry Cosman from Trinity College did a study about 2 years ago on hatred on American university campuses, and he found that African Americans in the United States have experienced or witnessed a racist attack or a racist incident that about 23% of African Americans have witnessed or experienced racism. About 28% of women, female students on campuses, 28% have experienced or witnessed a sexist incident. When it comes to anti-Semitism, 83% of Jewish American students on university campuses have experienced or witnessed an anti-Semitic act. This is off the charts. And there's a story that Martin Luther King often used in his speeches, the great civil rights leader. And he spoke about the story of Rip Van Winkle, about sleeping through a revolution. And he spoke about how the universities and the media and the churches were sleeping through a revolution, that young Americans, through sports and through music and through social events, were coming together and breaking the barriers of segregation. But it was the churches and the universities and the media that was reinforcing the old way, the old segregationist way of being. And he spoke about how the elites of society were sleeping through a revolution, that the change was happening despite the inactivities of the university, the media, and the leading institutions of society. And today I would argue, and I'll submit to you, that because of anti-Semitism, we have been sleeping through a revolution. And the revolution that I'm speaking about is sweeping the world. It's a reactionary social movement. It's a reactionary movement that uses anti-Semitism at its core. Genocidal anti-Semitism at the core of this ideology, of this reactionary social movement, blaming Jews with Nazi propaganda for every evil in the world. And we have been sleeping through the revolution, unable for short-term gain to name and to shame this reactionary social movement. This reactionary social movement uses Nazi, genocidal, anti-Semitic rhetoric to further its goals of subjugating women, of killing gay people, of subjugating religious minorities, of trying to destroy the very democratic institutions and principles that govern much of the world. And I'm speaking about political Islam. I am not speaking about Muslims, and I am not speaking about Islam. And I am not speaking as a xenophobic leader of a political movement. I am speaking as a scholar. The Muslim Brotherhood was started roughly 100 years ago, and it took the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a fake, forged document that purported to speak of a Jewish conspiracy, of Jews conspiring to take over the world and take over European society. And the Protocols was the fake document that justified the removal of Jews from European society. It was the fake document that justified putting Jews into ghettos. It was the fake document that enabled universities to voluntarily fire their Jewish professors and colleagues at German universities. It was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that justified putting Jews into labor camps, that justified even the final solution. And it's this document that is at the core of radical political Islam, the core of the Muslim Brotherhood, and its offshoots of Hamas, of Wahhabism, and even into the Shiite world of the revolution in Iran, the Shiite world. The Ayatollahs pay homage to the Muslim Brotherhood of al-Banai and Qutb and all the intellectual leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a well thought out enemy. This is a reactionary social movement that has a clear ideology. It has a clear religion. It has a clear political mission. It has a clear military mission. And with the Muslim Brotherhood and other political Islamists, you have to give them credit because they're open, they're honest, they're consistent. They speak about Jews in the language of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They speak about Jews in the language of Nazism. They speak about killing Jews. They speak about not just destroying Israel, but they speak about the poisonous Jews that are polluting the world with all of their ills and all of their problems. Even yesterday, Ayatollah Khomeini mentioned that the image, the degradation of women was somehow a Zionist Jewish idea that is polluting the world when it comes to women. Everything is blamed on the Jews. And we have remained silent. And this reactionary social movement, as we now know, is taking over mosques, it's taking over societies, it's ruling governments, it's creating havoc and genocide in Syria, it's causing 600,000 people to be murdered in this genocide, 13 million refugees going into Lebanon, Jordan, and other societies, shaking the core of these societies and the stability of these societies, and now entering into Europe and shaking the foundations and the stability of Europe. Many commentators looking at Brexit as a reaction to migration and rising nationalism and xenophobia and the like, which is coming out of this problem. So nobody is immune from this reactionary social movement. And we in the West, through political correctness, have not named it, have not stood up, not just for the rights of Jews, but for our principles as liberal, democratic, socially conscious, human rights-minded people and communities. And it's our silence, I would submit to you, that has allowed this revolution to gain momentum and to gain power as we sleep through the revolution. And why have we been sleeping? So I'm going to speak very briefly about the history of anti-Semitism, or the history of anti-Semitisms. There's three basic phases of anti-Semitism. There's the religious phase, the racist nationalist phase, and the contemporary phase. And what makes anti-Semitism unique is its genocidal character. Its inherently genocidal character, and I think this makes anti-Semitism and anti-Semitisms different from other forms of hatred, as pernicious and damaging as other forms are. So when the dominant perspective of perceiving reality was through the lens of religion, namely Christianity, the Jews were perceived as the quintessential other. A Jew could not have redemption if they didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. But what makes anti-Semitism so powerful is not only would the individual Jew cannot have redemption if they didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. People believe that if the Jews didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, the Jews would hinder the coming of redemption. And the fact that there wasn't redemption was the fault of the Jews. So the Jews had to be civilized, had to be converted, driven out, changed. When the lens shifted from religion to race and ethnicity and biologically determined nationalist notions of identity, the Jews were the wrong religion. And the Jews were perceived as polluting the purity of the white Aryan race and the white Aryan nation. So the Jews had to be removed. And unlike during the Christian time, there wasn't the option of conversion, of forced conversion or fake conversion or conversion. The Jews had to be eliminated, and they had to be removed from society, and this, I think, enters into the age of pogroms and culminates with the Holocaust. Now, these type of anti-Semitisms are generally, or have been generally, dismissed or dormant or unacceptable in society. In many of the institutions that we're connected to, our finest universities, the media of record, if anybody speaks about the old forms of anti-Semitism, the Christian forms of anti-Semitism, or the racist type of anti-Semitism, they'll be dismissed. They'll be ostracized. And in fact, I would argue that there's almost a fetish with the racist form of anti-Semitism. Leading liberal intellectuals and institutions didn't stand up to fight it during the 1930s and 40s. But today, in the 2000s, they are brave in condemning fascist, racist anti-Semitism wherever it exists or may exist. But today, the dominant form of anti-Semitism is an attack on Jewish peoplehood, of who we are as a people, of Israel, and the Jewish connection to Israel. And this form of anti-Semitism is not only acceptable, but I would argue encouraged, particularly in the institutions of places like the media of record in Western Europe, North America, the universities, and the like. Condemn the Zionist entity, condemn the racist entity, condemn the fascist entity, condemn the Nazi occupying, pink-washing entity, and you will have an excellent career. Focus on this entity. Focus on this entity as the cause of jihad Focus on this entity, on the problems of everything, including the cause of anti-Semitism, and you will be rewarded. And this is the old form of anti-Semitism. Focus on the Jew, while over here we have the rise of reactionary social movements, we have the subjugation of women, the taking over of societies with anti-democratic reactionary movements that are using anti-Semitism, and the focus on the homeland of the Jewish people and on Jewish peoplehood to focus here while they steal power over here. And it's our silence in the wake of the genocide that's happening in Syria, the refugee crisis. We, the human rights community, have remained silent while we focus on the Jewish people, and all these horrific things are taking place. But what's happening today is a wake-up call. Because many of us in the United States of America, in Canada, even in Europe, thought, well, we're okay. We can go to Oxford and Cambridge, the Sorbonne, we can get jobs in the New York Times and go to the Ivy Leagues, and everything's okay. It's those stubborn Israelis that don't make peace with their neighbors, who have settlement policies, who are a bit extreme, a bit tough, not negotiating too well. It's their problem, and let them deal with it. But the demonization of Israel, the attack on who Jews are as a people, didn't stop just with the Israelis. And now we see Jewish communities in France, in England, in Belgium, being attacked and demonized because of their association with the racist, apartheid, Nazi, occupying, pinkwashing entity. So Jews going to shul on Shabbat are targets from the extreme left, never mind the Islamist immigrants that are on the streets of Europe as well. The attack on Jews in Europe is an attack on who Jews are as a people. It's not the Christian anti-Semitism, it's not the racist anti-Semitism, although those type of ideas exist deep into society and deep into civilization. Perhaps they're there dormantly, and perhaps they enable the contemporary anti-Semitism to flourish. But now Jews of France are leaving. They're going to Israel. They're coming to the United States. They're going to Quebec, to Canada. They're going to England. And many Jews are actually migrating internally, leaving their communities in Paris and Marseille and going to safer suburbs. In Belgium, the same thing. And this wave of demonizing Jews of who they are as a people has now arrived on the shores of the United States of America in the universities. And it's in the universities where there's the battle, we're on the battlefield of ideas, fighting anti-Semitism on the battlefield of ideas. It's in this postmodern moment, this Edward Saidi and Michel Foucault's postmodern moment, where we have to condemn nationalisms of all kinds. So the Jews have a strong national identity, so we are inherently opposed to this postmodern moment with our strong identity of who we are as a people. So in the classrooms, those who articulate a connection to who they are as a people, culturally or to the homeland in Israel, are condemned, intellectually, philosophically. And what's interesting is Michel Foucault and Edward Said praised the Iranian Revolution. They thought the Iranian Revolution was going to be what Enlightenment was to France. The Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, would be to the Islamic world. And they did so because they're in this postmodern world, anti-Western, anti-American hegemony. And the extreme left, they call themselves the left, but there's no way that they are the left. People parade themselves as the left, parade themselves as liberals. But a liberal cannot be in bed with a reactionary social movement that's anti-democratic, anti-women, anti-gay, anti-religious minority, and anti-Semitic. It's not possible. But the red-green alliance that we call it, the extreme left, has this anti-Western hegemonic program that's similar to the Islamist program. And this is where they come together. So it's this type of anti-Semitism, the red-green alliance, the acquiescence to genocidal anti-Semitism, which is today's problem. And in the West, it's in our finest institutions. It's not so much on the ground, although it's beginning to percolate in this country with the desecration of cemeteries and the bomb threats in the United States. There is an awakening to some extent, and I don't think people have a handle on exactly what the extent is, but there is rumblings on the old racist type of anti-Semitism and the white supremacist anti-Semitism emerging in the United States. I recently gave a lecture at Columbia University, and I would urge our community to take action not just against the white supremacist racist anti-Semites, and we should take actions against them, but we have to realize that the roots of their anti-Semitism is racist Nazi ideology. Similar to the Islamists, their roots is also racist Nazi ideology. And the xenophobia which is emerging in Europe and perhaps here has its roots in extreme nationalism and anti-Semitism. So we should be mindful of the three forms of anti-Semitism that are coming out today and speak out against it. I come from a human rights background. I was a student of Irwin Cotler in Canada as part of the anti-apartheid movement in Canada and the United Kingdom. I fought and still fight for the indigenous rights of the First Nations of Canada and other indigenous people in the Americas. I was active in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. I went to Russia as a kid. We smuggled Ethiopian Jews from Sudan into Canada before they could come to Israel. So I'm coming from a human rights perspective. How is it possible that the P5+1 transferred in business deals and aid in frozen assets approximately $150 billion to a regime that's calling for the extermination of Jews? How is that possible? And how is it possible that if you speak out against this agreement, that in this society with the First Amendment, that some of you will be labeled for speaking out against it as Islamophobic or right-wing? Why is this irrational thinking taking place? And could you imagine, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, could you imagine at the height of the white supremacist Pretoria government in South Africa in the 1980s, that the United States of America and its Western allies would give the white supremacist regime, the apartheid regime, $150 billion of deals? There would be chaos on the streets. There'd be an uproar. But our community was divided. And our community, because it was intentionally divided and confused, was largely ineffective and silent. And this is my message to you. I think we need to support serious studies of contemporary anti-Semitism because things are changing quickly. The process is accelerating. People in my field have been doing this for 15, 20 years, trying to ring alarm bells out in the wilderness. And we were saying that things are going to happen. And they're happening. But they're happening even more quickly than we imagined. We need to get the best minds in the world together to understand the problem. Once you understand the problem, you can begin to discuss solutions. But we need to have informed discussions, informed debates. We have to fight anti-Semitism, hatred, wherever it is. If it's on the left of the Democratic Party or if it's on the right of the Republican Party, if it's part of a current administration or a past administration or a future administration, I think our community has to understand what anti-Semitism is today. Not what it was 70 years ago or hundreds of years ago, but to understand it today and to understand. In a Pew report, it was 2 years ago, it was stated in this report that American Jews over the age of 50, I believe it was only, it was 11% of Jews 50 years or older that experienced anti-Semitism. At the same time, 2 years ago, American Jews from 18 years old or younger, 29% experience anti-Semitism. So there's a generation gap. Things are shifting on campuses. And I think in a very significant way, we have to stand up to the challenge of our day. And I'll just end on one quick note. I was at Oxford University with a colleague of mine who's of Nigerian origin. His name is Olufemi Vaughan. He's a very renowned historian of West Africa. And when we were students together in Oxford, we brought Paul Robeson Jr. to Oxford. His father was the great Paul Robeson, Shakespearean actor, lawyer, civil rights activist in the 30s and 40s and beyond. So his son came to Oxford, and Femi and I were complaining about racism and anti-Semitism at Oxford. And it was there. It was palatable. And he was listening to us very patiently, kind of ramble. We were rambling on and on and on for about half an hour. And he said, the two of you should kind of, be optimistic, and you are in a great institution, and there are problems in the world, but for your generation, things are much easier for you and your generation than your parents, and much, much easier than your grandparents and your great-grandparents. But that every generation has to stand up, and in every generation we have to, as the Torah says, we have to confront this perhaps metaphysical hatred. And every generation we have to stand up to defend ourselves as a people, and in every generation we have to defend ourselves not just as a people, but people living in a democratic society. I was saying earlier, I'm Jewish in my Jewish traditional tradition of the Montreal Jewish community. I'm Jewish because my mother's Jewish. I became Jewish at birth because of my mother. I inherited my heritage. To be a citizen in a democratic country, we don't inherit it. We have to work at it. We have to fight for it. And I would submit to you that we can't allow Boeing or Siemens to take a quick fix from the Iranian revolutionary regime at the expense of innocent Syrians and innocent refugees. We can't allow political expedience to dictate our foreign policy when we're fighting this long hatred. And as Elie Wiesel and Robert Wistrich often said, anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. Once we allow the demonization of Jewish peoplehood to go unchecked, we see again the devastation and the destruction that's taking place against non-Jews, against Sunnis and Shiites, against Baha'is, against Yazdis, against women, against gay people. Because we remained silent because it was only the Jewish entity, the Israeli entity, the Zionist entity that was being attacked, so that was sort of okay. But once we become acquainted with this reactionary social movement and the interests in our society that is acquiescing and selling for 2 pieces of silver, our democratic institutions, the universities, the media of record, crucial elements of any vibrant democracy being sold for interests. And this is our challenge, to stand up as a community and not to tolerate the intolerable. And I was saying earlier, Emmanuel Levinas, the great Jewish philosopher whose family was murdered in the Holocaust, he survived because he was in France. He became perhaps among the most important philosophers of the 20th century, and he brought Jewish ethics and Talmudic thought to the university. And he famously said, based on the Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, that we become human the moment we see our face in the face of the other. When we see our face in the face of the other, that's the instant we're human. And when reactionary social movements demonize the other, justify subjugation, justify segregation, and justify annihilation, we cannot tolerate it. We have to stand up to it. And I think this is the challenge, to fight the hatred around the world, but to also fight the tolerance of the hatred in our institutions that are training your children and your grandchildren, who are training future leaders. And I'll end with one quick story. I was at Mount Sinai Synagogue Temple in Los Angeles, in Rabbi Wolpe's shul, and I spoke about similar issues. And in LA, there's a large Persian community, and a Persian couple, Iranian couple, came up to me after my lecture, and they were crying. And they were crying because they left Iran 3 years before the revolution. So they took all of their family and all of their money out, and they were fine. But they left because they realized the universities were falling to the extremists, to the Islamists, the political Islamists. And they left because they knew if the universities fall, the society will fall. And they were crying because their grandchildren at UCLA, brilliant young kids, were experiencing the anti-Semitism that, according to Barry Kosmin, the vast majority of young Jewish kids on campus experience. And we have been tolerant of this anti-Semitism, and the stakes are high. It's not just the future of what young Jewish kids think about themselves, of who they are, but it's also protecting the institutions and protecting the basic democratic principles that ought to govern the true university. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions. But the essence of your question is that extremists in Israel will use anti-Semitism as a way to deflect criticism of Israel, and they're using anti-Semitism to protect their extreme agenda. And what is being done to sort of, unpack anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. Okay, so I'll start with two things. In Ryan in 1971 wrote a book called Blaming the Victim. And there's a tendency in liberalism, according to Ryan, of blaming the victim. So we were speaking earlier. So many people will look at racism in the United States and subjugation and segregation of the African American community. And some will blame the African American community themselves for racism. So a stereotype of an African American man is they're lazy and aggressive. So we blame the African American for their subjugation. When women, and to some extent it still happens, but hopefully less so, but when women were abused sexually, often the prosecutor and the judges, the judicial system, would allow for the woman to be on trial. Why were you there? What were you wearing? What were you doing? So we sort of blame the victim for the crime. And I would submit to you that the focus, the demonization and the focus on Israel and blaming Israel for causing anti-Semitism, for causing jihad, for causing all the problems of the world misses the point, and it's a form of anti-Semitism. Now that's not to say that Israel has contradictions and problems and issues that, I think the two of us would probably point out some of the problems and contradictions in Israel, and perhaps we would disagree with, you would think there's more, I would think there's less, whatever. We can argue about some of the contradictions in society, but it's a democratic society with problems and contradictions. But it is a democracy. What we're arguing is, and I think through the study of anti-Semitism, which is very important, is that there is complex processes taking place, ideological, the discourse is shifting, there's economic, social, cultural processes taking place in this age of globalization. And we really need to learn who the players are. So radical political Islam, not Islam and Muslims, but political Islam in particular, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Wahhabism, the Iranian revolutionary regime, sees Jews in a very specific way. They can't accept, religiously, ideologically, they cannot accept a non-Muslim being an equal citizen to a Muslim. It's impossible for their worldview. We need to understand the rationality and the reason why. So even if Israel consisted of Tel Aviv, and the Jews of Tel Aviv demanded that they would be equal citizens to all other members of this society of Tel Aviv, a radical political Islamist will not accept it, particularly because they believe this is and was Islamic land. So for a Jew to be equal to a Muslim is unacceptable. So there's no possibility of a two-state solution or a solution, if you believe in democratic principles, in the region according to political Islam. So that has to be taken into consideration. And how does Israel decide to protect itself from this anti-democratic, violent threat is a whole issue that can be discussed. In addition, I wrote an article with Edward Kaplan of Yale University, and we interviewed 5,000 people in 10 European countries. And it was published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution. And we asked a series of questions about classical forms of anti-Semitism. Jews are cheaters in business, they stick together, the classical stuff. And then we asked them a series of questions about what we called Israel-bashing questions. So we would say Israel is an apartheid state, or do the Israelis poison the water of Palestinians? Do the Israelis intentionally shoot Palestinian children? Very extreme anti-Israel, or called Israel-bashing questions. What we discovered in the 10 countries is the level of anti-Semitism and Israel-bashing was relatively low. But what was astounding, or maybe not, is that what we discovered is that of the Israel bashers, they were 13 times more likely than the average population to be classically anti-Semitic. So there is a strong correlation. So we argued, if, buying bottled water in the supermarket was 13 times more likely to cause cancer, the water would be removed from the shelves immediately, and there'd be an inquiry about how they could, what happened, who was paid off. So there is an issue on several levels. So in the study of anti-Semitism, we're focusing on sort of anti-Semitism, this reactionary social movement, its ideology, and how the West, for all sorts of reasons, are acquiescing to it ideologically, intellectually, economically, culturally to some extent. And we're looking at the sort of processes within the context of globalization. Is what is happening in terms of anti-Semitism at Israeli universities? Is there reverse discrimination? There are Muslim students in Israel. Are they suffering? Are they anti-Semitic? And the like. So to describe the general condition of Israeli universities. So it's a great question. So Israel is a complex society. Israel has an amazing university system. Some of the top universities in the world are in Israel. Everybody knows about its technological research and high-tech industry, but there's also, I think, in social science, philosophy, it's a vibrant environment to be in. I really enjoy it there. Lots of debates, arguments, etc. And it's a very literate society, an educated society. So what's interesting, there's, I think, several manifestations of anti-Semitism are taking place in the universities in Israel. One, how do Israeli academics try to fit into this sort of global academic scene? You want to be published, you want to get tenure, you want to perhaps get a job at a good university in Europe or North America. You need to publish in certain journals that have certain ideological biases. So there's kind of that taking place. I think at this philosophical moment, postmodernity is very important, and Israeli scholars are trying to fit into that. And there's a lot of discussion, discourse, studies about Israeli scholars' relation to Israeli society, to the history of Zionism, to the treatment of minorities within Israel. So there's a lot of issues. Some people call it self-hatred. There's some of that taking place as well. I think that Israeli scholars, I think maybe after September 11th, after the Second Intifada, many scholars, Israeli scholars on the left, I think began to realize that the rise of radicalism, political Islam in Palestinian society, in the region, was antithetical to who they were, not only as scholars, but Jews and Israelis. And I think there was an awakening on the left in the peace camp that things were kind of unwinding and crumbling, and sort of the progressive peace moment that was prevalent in the 90s. There was hope for peace and a two-state solution. that was falling apart. So there was soul searching on the left there. And I think in terms of Muslim students, I would say many Muslim Israelis, I don't know what the percentages are, many have a conflicted relationship to the state of Israel and to the Jewish state of Israel. There's been some studies that are beginning to indicate, given the genocide in Syria and the implosion of Middle Eastern societies, countries in the region, that many Israeli Muslims or Palestinian Israelis are beginning to realize maybe it's not so bad to be in Israel. There's some of that. I don't think, there are refugees from Syria. There are refugees trying to come to Israel. There aren't many refugees leaving Israel. And there's also been a new phenomenon, which is interesting, is that Israeli Muslims or Palestinian Israelis are beginning to do very well at universities. Their enrollment is much higher. Their success rate at universities are beginning to be perceived by some in Israel on maybe the right as a threat. Their participation in the high-tech economy is growing. Their entrepreneurial success is growing. So there is perhaps the beginning of more integration into a dynamic Israeli society through the universities and into the labor market. That's beginning, which could be, I think, interesting and hopeful. So we've done this only for 2 years. We have 56 graduates. So we've taken 20, I think the first year we were like 23 or 24 students, and the second year a bit more. So we have 56 graduates. Of the 56 graduates, about 90% have taught a course on contemporary anti-Semitism. We don't know if this is going to continue. We hope it will continue. We're also trying to track how many students they have access to and what percentage of the course is focusing on contemporary anti-Semitism. Some are freestanding courses at the graduate and undergraduate level. Some are sections of capstone courses, introductory courses that first-year students need to take. So it varies. And we're tracking how many students are being impacted by our professors. We're also trying to establish a network of scholars. We have a listserv. People are trying to be supportive of one another in developing courses, getting reading lists together. One professor had trouble getting her course into the university because of the BDS movement, so some people are trying to help her. So we're trying to create a kind of a critical group or a network of scholars that are supportive. So we do this once a year at Oxford. If we had the funding, we would like to do a course in French and then at the Sorbonne, in Spanish, either in Madrid or Mexico, in Berlin and German, and really start to ramp up how many graduates we have and how many students are impacted. And then bring this network together every 2 or 3 years as a sort of a professional conference where people would present, where we can develop more publishing and really create a critical mass of scholars taking back the university. So we're at the beginning. So in July of 2017, we're starting our 3rd year. We've had the most applications we've ever had. We've had over 80 applications for about 30 spots. And the caliber is going up as well. The quality of the applicants is stronger. So word is getting out. I think we're getting traction. And I won't go into the details, but it was difficult to get the program into Oxford. There was some opposition. Some people started to say that we were a Zionist propaganda program and we shouldn't have been at Oxford. The opposition was squashed by brave, true liberals who maybe didn't agree with Israeli policy, but saw that we were doing something that was substantive in terms of its academic work, and they protected us. And now we've gotten offers from many colleges in Oxford who want to host us, and it's beginning to have traction at Oxford. I think after Brexit and some of the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which also was spilled over into Oxford itself, there's more awareness and more openness to what we're doing. So we're only starting our 3rd year.
Jewish relationships.
So the question is, with the Syrian refugees, what are their views of Jews and anti-Semitism? and how will this impact the United States? So there's a young scholar, or maybe not so young anymore, Gunther Jekeli, who's doing research now. He's interviewing Syrian refugees in Germany, Syrians who came to Germany, about questions of anti-Semitism. Thank you. And the levels of anti-Semitism among the refugee population are significant, but he also felt that they weren't deeply held views. This is his view. Also, I think in terms of the United States, the amount of refugees that the United States takes in from Syria is very low. I think it was only 10,000 last year. So it's low. And the impact, therefore, I think would be limited. And the vetting process in this country is significant, but that's not to say that there are very serious issues with this migration from that part of the world where there has been the indoctrination of hatred of Jews and hatred of others in a war-torn society. So these are very important questions and issues, and society should protect itself from it. Having said that, there is international law about refugees that I think should be upheld. The plight of refugees is a very serious matter, a very serious humanitarian matter, and I think that there has to be ways to accommodate refugees, whether it's permanently or temporarily, is a very important humanitarian moral issue. And I think refugees this whole issue has been neglected. There are, I think it's almost like 30 million refugees around the world, or even higher now. It's a major crisis, and we need to develop mechanisms that can accommodate refugees and mechanisms that can stop the problem at the source. And there are ways to, the Syrian refugee crisis could have been significantly averted if there was a safe space created in Syria for the refugees. There were many opportunities that were missed in this crisis, and we should learn from the mistakes going forward. And we should remember the refugee crisis from the Holocaust and the Shoah, and there has to be a place for the other, the downtrodden other, without risking our security. There's got to be creative ways to accommodate them. So the question is, can we work with Chabad to fight anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
And is the Muslim Brotherhood significant in Israel?
Yeah.
So
From what I know.
So I'll tell you a story about Chabad. We announced our seminar series in Paris, the Sorbonne, and we sent out an announcement announcing our new seminar series at the Sorbonne in Paris, and literally, in less than 2 minutes, literally, the Chabad rabbi from Paris called me and said, anything you want, we'll be happy to help you. So they were on the ball. No, we are an academic research organization, and we work with scholars, and we try to engage professors and scholars. We work with professors from all over the world, Jews, Muslims, Christians, atheists, left-wing, right-wing, people who are fighting hatred. We work with them. In our summer program, we have Muslim scholars who teach about anti-Semitism. There's a group called the Quilliam Foundation. It's a group of Muslim intellectuals who see anti-Semitism as a great threat to Muslim societies because they know the reactionary forces are using anti-Semitism to destroy their societies, their families, their mosques, and their states. And they see the sort of pseudo-liberalism, even in the Jewish community, as a great threat to Muslims in Muslim societies, that they want Jews to speak out more. They're very interesting. And in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood in Israel, yes, there is, the Muslim Brotherhood exists in Israel, and mainly, I believe, in the north, but now even in the Bedouin communities, they're beginning to become more radicalized. So there are issues, and I think we have to remember that Fatah and Hamas come from the Muslim Brotherhood. The origins are the Muslim Brotherhood. So even the nationalist branch of the Palestinian Liberation Movement has its roots in the Brotherhood. So it goes deep. So the question is there a link between political Islam on campus and funding?
Financial, are they actually
Yes, definitely. The Muslim Brotherhood, organizations like CARE and the Students for Justice in Palestine have their ideological roots in political Islam. They are being funded by international foreign actors and domestic actors that support this agenda. So there's definitely a correlation. In our research, we found a connection between the funding of American universities from places like Qatar that are major supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Qatari Foundation, Georgetown, Harvard to some extent, Yale, Berkeley, the list goes on. They've infiltrated many universities. And there's domestic funding, which is something that has slipped under the radar in this country. So there's domestic funding by people who support political Islam and are supporting universities and student groups on campus, but most importantly, university professorships, chairmanships, and research centers. And I would argue that this is a very serious matter because these are anti-democratic ideologies that are influencing curriculum. So the question is, can I give a brief history at ESET Yale? So to make a long story short, and as part of the book that's coming out, so ISGAP started in 2005, the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, which I'm the president and director of, and Ira is the coordinator of. In 2006, we brought ISGAP to Yale, and we called it the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism. And it was the first research center ever at a North American university on anti-Semitism, which should be a study in and of itself. And it was a successful, vibrant research center, and it was closed down in 2011. And at Yale, they close research centers when they're basically dormant or they don't have funding. We were vibrant with lots of funding. We had the largest academic research conference ever on anti-Semitism in 2010, which Barbara attended. We had 107 speakers with 500 people passing through this 3-day conference. And it was a vibrant center, to say the least. To make a long story short, in our new book, we are going to document how domestic funding by political Islamists basically closed down or helped to close down, contributed in closing down our research center. And there's a lot of pressure on universities to take money from certain sources, for publishing houses not to publish certain critical things of the Brotherhood and other Islamist or political Islamist movements in the Middle East. So this is definitely an issue, and it's definitely an issue that affected the closing down of YISA. And the funding issue, following the money in our project, as we know, money and power affects these private institutions to a significant extent. We're uncovering some of it. I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. But there's a very serious issue in where top universities in the United States get their money from and how it influences the curriculum agenda of leading universities. It's a very important issue. We're doing a small project that will shed light on it, and I hope that this project will garner more interest and research from people with larger expertise and budgets to do this. But it's a very important issue. So the question is, how do we get funded and how can people help us? So we're a nonprofit, we're a 501c3 organization in the United States, a charitable organization also in Canada, Europe, and Israel. And we're basically funded by individual family foundations, and you can get a tax receipt if you make a contribution. And I was saying earlier, it cost us about $7,500 to bring a professor to Oxford. And I'm not a business person, but our development specialist we were sort of going over the numbers. There's been a movement in New York to raise about $30 million to create chairs at leading universities. A leading university to create a chair in a department is about $3 to $5 million. And when you give the chair to a department, there's no guarantee who the university is going to hire. So it could be a chair on contemporary anti-Semitism studies, but they can hire somebody who thinks that Israel is the cause of all the problems of the world. You don't know who you're going to get. When we bring in our 30 professors at about $7,500 a professor, even if we get one or two bad professors, we'll only lose $7,500 to $15,000, not $3 or $5 million. And we calculated that it will cost about $100 a student if we succeed in educating professors and they go and teach their courses. So we have an inexpensive option. We're creating a network that's cost effective. You get a lot of bang for your buck. We're not wasting money or potentially squandering money. And we need the help. So ISGAP is a 501c3, and any donation that you have would be really helpful, and we need support. Thank you.
Please thank Dr. Sloan.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.